Oh, Fairfax, what would you do without the victim narrative? You'd have to cut half your journalists. And yes, I use the term journalist loosely. So the latest source of oppression against women in Australia is the superannuation system. I will be stuffed. How superannuation sells women short. Australia's superannuation system is failing in its primary goal of providing universal benefits and is systematically biased against women, a major study has found. Oh yes, a major study. A major study by who? Well, a mob called Per Capita, with the tagline, "Fighting Inequality in Australia." On page 3, we find out that Per Capita is an independent, progressive think tank dedicated to fighting inequality in Australia. We work to build a new vision for Australia based on fairness, shared prosperity, community, and social justice. Or in other words, we're committed to redistributing other people's money. Here's their basic thesis. The superannuation system is systematically biased against half the population. Women are simply not being assisted by super towards a reasonable standard of living in retirement. Women's superannuation balances at retirement are 47% lower than men's. As a result, women are far more likely to experience poverty in retirement in their old age. Superannuation is failing women. Now, this is just an oversimplified mischaracterization of superannuation. The amount of superannuation you'll get in retirement is in direct proportion to how many years you work, how high your salary is, and what kind of return your superannuation fund makes. Gender has nothing to do with it. But how can you say that? Clearly, women are retiring with less superannuation. Well, you see, what the people at Per Capita call bias and discrimination, I call life choices. Let's have a look at the litany of reasons given for this situation. Sadly and unnecessarily, women's retirement income in Australia has taken on the features of a wicked problem. It arises thanks to a confluence of diverse circumstances: an inadequate age pension, overrepresentation in lower paid occupations, the gender pay gap, no super at low pay levels, effective marginal tax rates, carer responsibilities, unpaid domestic work, the complexity of the super system and frequency of changes to it, age discrimination, unaffordable housing, longer lives, poor financial literacy, cost availability of childcare, relationship breakdowns, and casualised work. So how many of those factors are life choices? I'd say nearly all of them, but even of the ones that aren't. An inadequate pension system. So if you're a single person at retirement age with less than $457,000 worth of assets and you're not a homeowner, you're entitled to the full aged pension, which is about $23,000 a year. And if you do own your own home and you have less than $254,000 worth of assets, you can still get the full pension. Now, this report is primarily concerned with those that don't have much in the way of assets and don't own their own home. But it's not as if they're going to be left on the street. There is a decent social safety net. Overrepresentation in lower paid occupations and the gender pay gap. Two variables entirely within the power of women to change themselves. Choose engineering. No one's stopping you. You don't have to go into social work, but if you do, don't bitch about not making the big bucks. But even here, the authors employ some dodgy use of statistics to gin up the pay gap issue. Because superannuation contributions are a direct function of pay, the gender pay gap ensures that women's balance will be systematically lower. The most recent data from the ABS indicates that women's pay rates for equivalent work are 10% lower than men's, and women's total pay across the workforce, adjusted for fewer hours worked, is 31% lower. Interesting use of the word equivalent there. They didn't say the same work, but they certainly implied it. Note from their own chart, they're talking about non-managerial adult hourly ordinary time cash earnings. But the ABS report from which they get that figure says nothing of the sort. In 2014, the average female wage was 87% of the average male wage, non-managerial adult hourly ordinary time cash earnings. The median female wage was 90% of the median male wage. There's your 10% gap. This gap has remained relatively steady over the past decade. It says nothing about equivalent work. Data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics confirm that women's superannuation balances are systematically lower than men's, and the gap increases throughout their working lives, reaching $70,000 by the statutory retirement age of 65. Now, part of the gap at the older end of the age scale is an artefact of history. Women that are 65 or older today were far less likely to have a full-time job when they left school in the early 1970s than women are today. And even by 1988, superannuation only covered about half the working population, most of whom were male. By 1992, it hit 80% after the superannuation guarantee was rolled out the year before. So all things being equal, the gap in superannuation between men and women should shrink over time. You can see this in the superannuation data from that same ABS report. Men aged 55 to 64 in 2013-14 had a much higher average superannuation balance than women the same age, 322,000 compared with 180,000. There was less discrepancy between men and women aged 44 years and younger, but male superannuation balances were still higher in every age group. But of course there will still be a gap for obvious reasons like work choice, the decision to start a family. Notice that there is barely any gap up to age 34 and then the gap starts to widen substantially. Why? Because women start families and are most often the primary caregivers. And who supports them when they stay home with the kids? Oh, that's right, it's men. Unless they're single mothers, and to that I say, life choices. Now, of course, they won't be contributing to super while they're at home, but the man will be, which shouldn't be a problem if you don't get divorced. But if you do, you can put your hand in your partner's super and take some of that, and you'll probably get to keep the house as well if you have one. Consider this data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. In 2013-14, women were a little more likely to own their own home, 61.5% compared with 58.7% of men, while rates of men and women with a mortgage were similar, 33.8% and 33.5% respectively. Women were slightly more likely to own their home without a mortgage, 28.1% compared with 25% of men. Now, how could that be? We know that women earn less, as the authors of this report keep reminding us, and we know when women do work, they're more likely to work part-time than men, but they have slightly higher rates of home ownership. Are women just better at paying down a mortgage, or are they doing better out of divorce settlements? Bettina Arndt dug this data out a few years back on the financial position of 50 to 70-year-olds who were either divorced or separated. And you can see that women do far better in the home ownership stakes and not too shabbily when it comes to income. But true to form for victim narratives, this report has 3 pages full of them. Take this one, for example. I can't afford to contribute to my own superannuation, can't afford to take holidays, nor can I take extra paid leave as I live pay to pay. There are many like me who, after a midlife divorce, accepted extra in the equity of their home so that the children were not disturbed, rather than a share of his super. My husband had a for-life government pension, which after 20 years of support, I could not make a claim on. I maintained the home and full-time care of our child while he went offshore and earned big tax-free dollars. He now lives on a luxury yacht and travels regularly while I live from pay to pay. So here's a woman who had the choice to take a share of her husband's superannuation, but she opted for more equity in the home, and now she's bitching about the decision that she made. And the pity party goes on. Get a load of this one. I think I'll need to work until I'm 120 to be a comfortable and self-funded retiree. I'll have a reduced ability to host Christmas, less ability to join children and grandchildren on summer holidays. I live alone with my dog. My dog is old and I probably won't have her much longer. I would not be able to afford to keep another dog, so it will just be me. A very lonely life. First off, we have no context. How did your life get to this point? What were the decisions that led up to it? Is any of it your responsibility? What is the point of this? You can find plenty of people in similar circumstances, all with unique stories. My superannuation balance is very small for someone my age. Why? I elected to live and work overseas for 15 years, so I contributed nothing during that time. Whose fault's that? No one but mine. I made that decision. I have to live with it. So what do the good folk at Per Capita recommend? Well, they have a range of recommendations, but mainly they want to top up people's super if it gets below what they call an accumulation pathway that would set you up for a decent standard of living in retirement. And they recommend this for both men and women, although of course it would benefit more women than men. And who would pay for this? Well, the federal government, or in other words, you and me and everyone else that pays tax. As I said earlier, the gap between men and women's superannuation will shrink over time as more women retiring in future years will have had longer careers and higher paying jobs than their predecessors. And even if you opted to raise kids for 20 years, you'll probably do alright if you decide to get divorced. But it's unlikely that the gap will shrink entirely, and that's not a problem that needs fixing. The fundamental false assumption time and time again by those obsessed with equality is that outcomes should be the same for different groups. You are relieved of the responsibility for your own life outcomes. It's the system's fault. You stayed home and looked after the kids for 20 years, then could only get low-paid, unskilled labour and got divorced, and now you don't have much. Yep, life happens. Take responsibility for your role in it. You get dealt a hand of cards, and be careful how you play them. Superannuation already provides a level playing field. The rest is largely down to life choices and a little luck thrown in. So would you like to contribute to other people's superannuation, or does enough of your income get redistributed already? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you next time.